Steve, how are you, sir?
I'm splendid. Thank you so much for asking, Mark. How are you, mortal appoint?
I'm fine, and the more I look at you, the more I think you're looking very much like Trotsky. You've got your Trotsky beard.
It's coming on. It's my feral look. It's my unshaven, unkempt, I just can't be bothered look.
Trotsky, of course, was Russian. Which leads me to ask you, what are we talking about today?
Я не знаю, товарищ. I don't know, comrade. I think that what we were looking to talk about was have a discussion around, what's going on in the world and certain headline news articles that are coming in. Just to have some musings around them, perhaps. And you can probably hear a truck going past my house in the background, but just to have some musings about them. So I think that we were going to have a little chat about Ukraine, weren't we, and what was going on there, and just some thoughts around it, really. We're not here to give a view of it, whether it is right or whether it is wrong. I don't think. I think that what we're going to do is perhaps ask some questions.
Just look out the window of that truck, see if it had a Z on the side. You never know. The Ukraine, we both watched one of the terrestrial UK news channels on YouTube, did a video. It was really an update about where we are with the what's called the Russo-Ukrainian War, or the Ukrainian-Russo War. And there's just a few things that we thought, perhaps there's something to talk about. The first thing on that actual video was really comparing Volodymyr Zelensky with Vladimir Putin, wasn't it? And their leadership styles. Is there a difference, do you think?
What we need to always bear in mind here, in my view, is that the editing and the cutting and the delivery of a piece of news is driven for the audience that it's meant to receive it. So it's put together in the shape that is going to get the best propaganda value for the audience that's receiving it. So I would imagine that Russia Today will have a very high view of the way that Vladimir Putin is operating and leading, and anything that goes west is going to have a very high view of the way that Volodymyr Zelensky is handling and doing things. So I don't think that the actual reporting gives us a fair picture of either man. I think that both men have proven to be very capable over these years, and not just for this conflict that's going on. Zelensky has sort of stepped up in terms of this conflict, but I think that Putin has demonstrated something quite impressive in terms of his political abilities, and that's notwithstanding that I have absolutely no truck with the invasion of the Ukraine. I think that was a very, very foolish move, and I'm totally opposed to the invasion of the Ukraine. And while that stands, I think that then we need to ask further questions around why. Why did he do this? Because it is a terrible thing to have happened. It's caused untold misery and suffering. And what I'm always intrigued with is the why question. What led him to do that? Where did it come from? Is it just because he's a flipping maniac leader like Stalin or Hitler or something like that? And I don't see those comparisons. But Zelensky and Putin, interesting guys.
Well, I'll start with Putin because you just finished on him. There is a lot of commentary around the fact that when he made the decision to have they didn't call it a war at that time, did they? A special military operation. He was almost like egging himself very distant from everybody else because he was shut away during COVID for some time, and there seemed to be a change in the way he saw the world or whatever. I don't know how true that is. I don't know enough about that. All I can say is that when you can compare the two, there's two things that come to mind for me. One, how Zelensky, when he was put into the presidency, he was a stand-up comedian. And yet he has enabled himself or has become this world statesman of some quite impressive statesmanship skills in the way he projects himself and the Ukraine on the world stage. He's very seldom in a suit. He's always in like fatigues, like half battle fatigues, isn't he? That's deliberate. Because he obviously knows stage presence and how to conduct himself in front of others. He's also got quite impressive grasp of language. He can speak, I don't know how many languages, but he speaks English very well. He seems to be the person that cometh the hour, cometh the man. He's stepped forward and he's conducted himself in a certain way. The video that we referenced, it's trying to say that he's always seen with the troops. He's always there, whereas you don't really see that with Putin. Putin is a much more reserved figure, but very choreographed. I mean, they're all choreographed. But he's very choreographed on the grand scale. A lot of white and gold buildings, trappings behind him, and then there's statesmen and women from different countries, his so-called allies, big tables and so on. So it is very marked as far as what the content seems to be coming to us, but you're absolutely correct. How much is that doctored? How much is actually putting across a narrative that may or may not be true? I don't know. So there is a marked difference. And that's the first thing that I think comes across.
I think Zelensky has risen to the occasion. I'm really intrigued with the fact that, from what I have read anyway, that both he and Putin were very close to knocking out a peace treaty, and that got scuppered by the Western nations. If that is true, and who knows what's true these days, but if that is true, then that's a damning indictment on the West, because in my thinking, that would presuppose that the West have an agenda, and the agenda being to basically bleed Russia from as much of its military power as possible. And if that's the case, then that is driven pretty much heavily by the Americans. And I have a very low regard for that particular type of action, because there are people dying out in Ukraine for no reason other than the Americans. That would be a dreadful thing if that were the case.
Well, you only have to watch Oliver Stone's JFK to know that this may be a recurring issue. At his farewell address, President Eisenhower did say, beware of the MIC, the military-industrial complex, did he not? In fact, right now, there are congressional hearings into UFOs. Has the US government been deliberately misleading the public? There's a whistleblower who's come out and saying that some agency within the US government have gone rogue. There's no accountability. It's all black money. You don't know where the funding's coming from, who's in control and who's deciding. But certain things are not being told to the government. And that's the concern more than the UFOs, it seems to be, that who is controlling who. So yes, that kind of thing, as soon as you start looking into the Ukraine and Russia and the global effects, you start getting into the weeds very quickly, don't you? You can very quickly go into conspiracy theory, however.
Yeah, you can, but the problem that we've discovered over the last few years is what was conspiracy theory becomes conspiracy fact after a couple of years. Things that we were told were just a conspiracy theory have now actually turned out to be true. And I'm not going to go into the details of those because YouTube doesn't allow certain discussion on their community guidelines. What is truth? What is fiction? I think that it's so important. It is so important when we look at all of these things that nothing is black and white. And when it comes to geopolitics, absolutely nothing is black and white. There are always all sorts of Machiavellian schemes going on in the background somewhere or other, which is why I find the Ukraine conflict very fascinating in so much as why? Why did he do this? Why did Putin do this? There must have been a reason. So what are the building blocks going back that have led to this event? And you don't have to look back too far. I suppose you do nowadays. It's over 30 years ago, I suppose. Around about sort of 1991, somewhere around about that NATO said that they would not move 1 inch closer to the east when the Soviet Union collapsed. And now they've moved thousands of miles to the east. So from that point onwards, we've had bad faith. The West agreed that they would do something, and I appreciate it wasn't written in treaty. I appreciate it wasn't agreed across all of these groups. I appreciate that. But the word was spoken. We will not move 1 inch further towards the east. Well, they lied. And I'm very mindful of America. If the Russians were to have gone into Canada, or if the Russians were to have gone into Mexico and squeezed the United States of America from either the north or from the south, America would not tolerate that. So why would we expect Russia to tolerate NATO moving further east and expanding eastwards? I don't see why Russia would tolerate that. I think we'd be foolish to think that they'd tolerate that unless we are so up ourselves and proud and arrogant that it's okay for us because we are right, which I'm not convinced that we are. None of that negates Putin's negative actions.
You are correct, especially with, right now, again, Cuba. You've asked a couple of times, why did Putin do it? It depends on who you're reading, and you have to treat it with a pinch of salt. There is a common narrative, at least in the West, that he thought he could get away with it. He took Crimea in 2014, and he thought that Ukraine was weak, and we're going to take them over quickly before the first year was over for his victory parade, and therefore it would be a kudos thing. In the country currently of Russia, I would imagine he's already at the top. Why would you need more kudos? What's in it for him? That's what I've not understood. Well, apart from the fact, it's often pointed out that Russia has the level of economy as Italy and Belgium combined. It's not that great in comparison to other Western nations. How long Russia can continue with the war, it will have the manpower, but whether it's got the infrastructure and the financial ability to do so is another thing. Taking over Ukraine quickly would have really expanded the economy of Russia, and I don't know if that's anything to do with it, whether it's just a purely economic rather than a political thing. Could be both.
running through the center of all geopolitics is money. That's what everything pivots around in the West. There's money in this. There'll probably be money in it for Russia somewhere along the line, but there's money in it. And the people that are the orchestrators of this conflict and this war, the people that are continuing it to flourish and develop and grow and destroy the lives of so many good men and women on the Ukrainian and the Russian side, there's money in it. And that's what they care about. They care about money, they care about maintaining their power base. And I feel that it's really saddening. What probably saddens me most about the Ukraine conflict is I see very little diplomatic activity on the world stage to try and resolve this. It's almost like America and the West are so short-sighted and so blinkered that there is only one strategy, and that strategy is to demilitarize or deplete Russian military so that they are no longer a viable threat to America and its allies. And that, I think, is woeful. Now, there may well be a host of diplomatic activity going on behind the scenes that we are not aware of, and I hope to God that there is. But we should have statesmen and women flying all around the globe looking to actually find a peace process and to resolve this. And if, as I said earlier, Western political leaders were people who have blocked a peace process earlier last year, then I think that is ethically and morally repugnant. And I have no regard for those Western leaders at all. They are not statespeople.
I have always been fascinated by World War II, and it was a shock, a literal shock. I remember when I realised, it was back in 2005 or something like that. Gordon Brown was the Prime Minister of the UK, and the UK that year made its final payment to the US for all the money and equipment that had been loaned it in World War II. So I was born 1964, grew up, and for 50 odd years, nothing was ever mentioned in my understanding about payments. Sometimes it missed it. A vast amount of money had to go back to the States. In a way, for 60, 70 years, Britain had no choice to be allied with the US because he had to pay off all this money. Nothing's been gifted to Ukraine. They're having to borrow the money to buy all the reparations, all the equipment, I should say, all the shells. And that is going to take decades for the Ukraine to pay off. It's like when you tie up with a bank for a mortgage and you're with them for, well, until you pay it off, or 25, 30 years. Everything's been put on loan, and that's going to have to be paid back. So it's like a double-edged sword. If it is to deplete Russian military, it's also to keep Ukraine in the western perimeter for some decades to come. And the best way to grab someone by the curlies is own the money.
This god mammon, this love of money, this is going to be the undoing of the Western nations that we grew up in. I spent 4 decades serving the Crown, and I had an absolute, genuine belief in what I served. I believed that what we were doing was right. I believed that we were on the moral high ground. And it's only been in the last few years that I have now looked at what's going on. I struggle to get alongside what you're doing and why you're doing this, because there are better ways to do this. There are better ways to behave. And you no longer hold the high ground. Look at what happened last year with Russia using cluster bombs in the Ukraine. It was denounced as a war crime for anyone to use cluster bombs in the Ukraine. Now America are supplying cluster bombs to the Ukraine to use against the Russians, and that's all fair. You can't have it both ways. It is either a war crime and it is wrong, or it is not a war crime, but you can't have it as a war crime for Russia, but it's okay for America to allow that to happen. That's just farcical. And I don't understand why people are asleep to half of this.
Well, we talked about this before. Because they are distracted elsewhere.
I think there's so much distraction going on. Distraction around gender identity, distraction around unidentified flying objects, or UAPs, whatever they call them these days. Distraction around climate and the heat waves that are going through everywhere and the world is burning. And you think to yourself, actually, I'm not 100% sure that that is accurate as absolutely everywhere. I've got no doubt that the temperatures are going up. I've got no doubt that there's climate change. I've got no doubt all of that. But I'm not so sure that the way things are being presented is actually accurate. I'm mindful now when I hear somebody start to date set of by 2025, the sea levels are going to be 1 metre higher and we're not going to be able to do this. I'm like, okay, in 2025, I've noted that and I'm going to check to see how right you are. Because we've had this for so many decades now. By the time we get to this year, this is going to happen. By the time we get to that year, this is going to happen. By the time we get to that year, this is going to happen. And you know what? It doesn't happen.
Because, and we talked again previously about this, because the ones who are reporting this are part of the agitation creation industry. It's just another form of getting people agitated to consume more of what they're offering.
You're right. This is being exacerbated as well within our schooling, because schools are no longer a place of education. They are a place of indoctrination. Kids are not being educated. They're not being encouraged to think and to ask critical questions, to be a critical thinker around things. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so intrigued with Ukraine and Russia. Why? Why is this happening? And you haven't got to look far, like I said, and you track things back and you see the dishonor that sits on one side, and you think to yourself, yeah, well, if I was on that other side, I'd probably push back as well. I honestly don't think that the West has acted in a very honorable way. And that does not negate the terrible way that Putin has acted. I am no cheerleader for the way that Vladimir Putin has behaved, but I understand, I think, why he's behaved in that way.
You talked earlier about the cluster bombs. It's one thing I wanted to bring up. As soon as I saw the video that we're reacting to, we both watched, there's part of it that shows the dash cam, the window cam of a car that swerves when to the right there's a huge explosion. And it's a building that was hit, and you can see someone slowed it down on another video. You can see the missile coming down, and they've recognized it to be Ukrainian. It's attacking a civilian target in reprisal to the Russians attacking civilian targets. And as soon as Russia is hit, they'll say it's a terrorist attack, but they'll never say it when they've hit the Ukrainians, and vice versa. And this brings up something that has always got me. No one really talks about the civilians who were suffering through all of this and losing their homes and being made destitute, losing their businesses, having family members, well, a lot of them had to flee, didn't they, and died. And also the hidden scandal of where are the children gone? They seem to have been taken. Why are we never talking about these things? It's always about cluster bombs and defences and tanks and who's got the best weaponry, but never the ordinary people.
No, I think that you're right, mate. I think that the toll of human suffering is something we gloss over for some reason, and we really shouldn't. We are supposed to have been creatures who are enlightened, that we have moved to a higher state of being, and that we don't do the things that our ancestors did because they were all just savages in the past, and we are no longer barbarians and savages. We are enlightened people. No, we're not. No, we're not. We haven't changed. We still treat people very poorly. We still don't look after humanity. We are still one of the only animals that will just kill for pleasure, for conquering territory. I don't know any other mammals that do that. There may well be some, but I don't think that that's the case. Humans are a very aggressive bunch of people in the right circumstances. And it doesn't have to be that way. You are absolutely right about the children. What happens to the kids in these situations? Well, I can tell you what happens to them. They get trafficked. They get smuggled into different parts of the globe where they get abused, and they get handed from one abuser to another abuser until eventually they either die or that's just their life. So that's what happens to the children, mate. There's a whole business in trafficking children. In fact, there's a film out, isn't there? Sounds of Freedom, which is a film which has been made on a sort of shoestring budget, which is doing very well in the box office and has had lots of anti-comments regarding it. And I think so, what? And again, this is another why. Why on earth would you be anti this sort of thing where you are rescuing children from sex trafficking? Why would you? Why? What's wrong with that?
Who is complaining?
In the mainstream media, there's lots of commentary around the fact that this is a QAnon-inspired film, and you think, no, it's not. This is about forbidden people rescuing kids from sex trafficking. But over the years of my policing career, I have dealt with paedophilia in terms of people who have committed atrocious acts on children. I cannot think of a more noble cause than rescuing children from the clutches of people like that. And anybody who poo-poos that, I would question why. What have you got in it? What skin have you got in the game? Clearly, there's something either financial or perhaps even personal preference that you have got skin in the game on. And I find it staggering. So anybody that has been involved in warfare, anybody that has been involved in any of these areas of life, anybody that has seen the horror and suffering that these things cause should be sitting back and going, we need to stop all this crap. We just need to stop it. And we need to sit down and we need to talk about what we need to do. Does that mean it's going to be an easy conversation? No. No conversations like this are easy. But does that mean we shouldn't do it? it means that we should do it. If a conversation is going to be hard and it's going to be difficult and it's going to annoy you and it's going to rub you up the wrong way, then that's all the more reason to sit and talk to somebody until you can thrash out something that you can agree on, and then you build on that common ground. What I see at the moment is a distinct lack of political leadership from the West and a doubling down on leadership from the East. And you've got these two opposing forces that, should they clash head to head without that Ukraine buffer zone in the middle, could cause absolute mayhem for the rest of the world.
The final point then is what Zelensky said of Russia. The Russian actions are evil. Now, you mentioned the children being trafficked, and it seems to be under the Russian watch, with the accusation of mass torture. It's like everything. It could be misinformation, it could be based on truth, or it could be hyperbole. Who knows? I'm interested as to why Putin would deliberately harm his allies with the grain supply, if that is correct. If they really are bombing Odessa, and there's a place on a river which is very close to Romania, why would you do that? Why would you allow these things to happen and then try and maintain that you have credibility ethically and morally? Is Zelensky correct?
I would be skeptical, or I would be wanting to ask the questions before I sort of came to a very clear conclusion on what I'm being told. I don't believe what I'm being told on face value. I don't believe it. That doesn't mean to say it's not true. It means that I will need to corroborate it elsewhere before I do believe what they're telling me. They could be absolutely truthful, but I'm not going to take people at face value, particularly from the media, because, as you say, it's the agitation and fear creation engine. They've got an agenda there. Is Putin destroying those grain tankers and silos and all the rest of it? Is he? I don't know. We're told that he is and that he's blocking these things, but is he blocking them? Or is there some aspect of the agreement that the West won't agree with, and Putin said, well, that's my terms, and therefore you either agree to that or you don't? Or is it the other way around, that Putin's saying, well, these are my terms and the West won't agree to it, and so is it the West that are causing them to be held up? You just don't know. Do I think that Putin has distanced himself from all of his allies? I don't even think that's true, you know. He has got a very high popularity in Russia, as I understand it. He is very well thought of by the Russian people. That's one of your first litmus tests. When Prigozhin marched on Moscow with the Wagner group, did he? All the West was reporting about, this is the collapse of Putin, this is the demise of Putin, this is him coming undone. And I'm thinking, really? Was it? Or was that some sort of false flag operation? And was there something else going on in the background there? Because it certainly hasn't affected Putin's ratings. And I don't know that the grain and supplies and all the rest of it aren't getting out, but maybe out of a different way.
I was listening to, again, a British terrestrial news outlet, and they had a general on there, and just after an event a couple of weeks ago where a reporter seemed to have been targeted with other reporters in a cafe where they were meeting. Some of them were Russian dissidents, and one of their colleagues was killed. So there may have been a bit of shock value. And this guy said, I've been reporting on Russia for some years, but I think we need to start calling these people out. Why are they so unwilling to go against what could be described as unethical conduct by their government? But what he didn't say was that if you did that, you're going to spend 10 years in prison, possibly more. And it's very difficult under the current system to speak out. And it's the argument about, if you're going to criticize the whole of the Russian people, then you're already going down the wrong route. Because did we blame Germany for the Nazi atrocities? Or did we blame the Nazis? I'd like to think we blamed the Nazis. Because there was a common thing at the time, there's no good Germans. In fact, they made a film of it, didn't they? One good German. Well, there were many good Germans. They had no ability to protest or to stand out, because if they did, them and their family are going to end up in a concentration camp. So is there something similar with Russia? The problem here, and it's throughout history, why is it that so many people are always put in charge that you can't get rid of when they go rogue? And some do. I'm not saying this is the case now, but when you have a system that nobody can stand up to the boss, then what kind of a system is that? Why do we permit this continually to happen? And it's like, well, this is 2023. Why are we still arguing all about this BS? But then again, the people who don't want things to change are the ones who are in power.
The point that you make about the Germans and was it the Germans or was it the Nazis? Well, the Nazis were predominantly Germans, so in that respect it was obviously a Germanic fault. That said, there were so many good German people. There are so many good Ukrainian people, and there are so many good Russian people. We need to recognise the value of individual humans and the intrinsic value that an individual has. I'm not soft on any of this stuff. I worked in the Cold War, and I worked against the old KGB, and I worked against the Russians. I'm very aware of their history and what they've done and all the rest of it. But I've met some amazing Russian people, and I've met some amazing Ukrainian people. And the people themselves are not the issue. It is the political system that is the issue, not just in Russia either. I think in the West as well. The political system in the West is corrupted purely by the love of money. It's all driven by capitalism, by finance. And if you've got money, you're going to stay in power. You're going to get into power. And if you've got money, you're going to stay in power. And if you've got money, you're going to be able to have a life of Riley while you swan around the world, strutting your stuff on world stages. When in reality, you need to get to grips with the people that you're supposed to be leading. But we have no leadership.
A lot of people would say it's the curse of capitalism, globalization. Well, no, you only have to go back to the 18th century and look at mercantilism and physiognomy. The idea is you were rich if you had land, or you were rich if you had trade. And the British Empire and the French would go out there to grab it at all costs. And again, that ultimately comes down to wealth.
It's all driven by the spirit of mammon, mate, the love of money. It's a great shame, because there are some amazing people in this world. As we talked about on our last discussion around foreign runs ashore, I've travelled all around the globe. I've stepped off ships in the middle of some real rough old places, and I've met the most amazing people. It's the politicians that let us down.
We'll have to do an episode just on politicians.
Yeah, that'd probably be unairable.
Boring.
It's a tragic situation for both Ukraine and Russia. Russia were foolish for going in and incredibly wrong for going in. But I do think that there are circumstances that we need to understand as to why they did that, because it's not black and white.
So the West is equally as culpable, perhaps, as the East.
I think the West has got a lot of questions that should be answered, but the West has had lots of questions that they should have answered since 1990 in the Gulf Wars. Over the last 30 years, I do not believe the West has covered itself in glory.
Food for thought for next time.
Bye-bye.
Take care, mate.